Welcome to CCL's training. It's a weekly webinar program of Citizens Climate Lobbies that provides CCL supporters like you and I with access to in-depth training opportunities on topics related to climate change and effective climate advocacy. I'll be your host tonight, Brett Cease, and our topic is from intuition to insight, understanding how we all make meaning. What a profound topic, huh? Well, hopefully our training will be able to explore with our first installment in CCL's Bridge Advocacy Program, a deeper look at how all of us arrive at decisions informed beliefs. We're going to use some insights from behavioral science. We're going to explore why intuition and emotion usually come first, and how understanding that reasoning often follows and justifies our initial reactions really matters in our climate advocacy. So our focus tonight is going to be on self-awareness as a foundation for stronger, more respectful climate advocacy across differences. We are so glad that you're here tonight. I have the privilege of serving as CCL's Vice President of Field Operations, where I get to lead and support an extraordinary nationwide volunteer network, including you, through some advocacy initiatives and trainings like Bridge. I joined CCL as a volunteer back in 2011, and I've served in a lot of the roles throughout our volunteer leadership and field operations work, which makes it really especially meaningful for me tonight to help bring this framework to life. Because over the past half year, I've had the honor of leading a really large collaborative team of staff and academic researchers and volunteer peer reviewers to develop Bridge, and really been able to draw on my background in education and public policy and my lifelong passion for connecting civic engagement with effective advocacy. So I'm really incredibly proud of what our larger team has built, and really excited tonight to begin sharing Bridge. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here. And we're going to really have a pretty straightforward agenda tonight. We'll begin with how people, exploring how they really make decisions. We're going to introduce a powerful metaphor called the elephant and rider as a shared way to understand what's happening beneath the surface in conversations that we're all participating in. And then we'll turn into, helping know how to read resistance, explore the current context we're operating in, and then wrap up with a practice activity, and then look ahead to what comes next in our Bridge pathway together. So full agenda, but if we've done our job well, you're going to walk away with the following 3 learning goals. Hopefully everyone will be able to understand how the elephant and rider framework explain why emotions, identity, and intuition shape decision-making before our own reasoning and advocacy conversations kick in. We'll also be able to identify real-time signs of trust that's being developed, and that elephant activation, you'll know what I mean in just a bit, when we're in conversations, including in individuals' own responses. And we'll also have the chance to build a shared language for our relational advocacy that really helps all of us slow down, stay curious, and create conditions where productive engagement becomes more possible. So with that, let's jump right in, right? And for those that are just tuning in later, especially, or for those of you that haven't had the chance yet to interact with Bridge, I'll put a short link in the chat here. It's just cclusa.org/bridge. But today we're really starting something that might feel a little bit different than traditional advocacy training. Before we're going to talk about messaging or persuasion or policy even, we're going to talk about how humans actually make decisions. Because everything else in Bridge, which is an acronym for building relationships in dialogue, growth, and engagement, builds off of this. And before we dive into any of that, though, I'm just going to have fun tonight. And I want to engage everyone here in a quick thought experiment, something that we call the instant opinion test. So just know this, there's no wrong or right answers here. And I'm just going to read a short statement, and I want you to notice what happens inside of you. Not what you think about it, but what you feel first. I don't want you to analyze it or explain it or judge it. Just notice the very first reaction that shows up, and then we'll come back to what it tells us in a moment. Here's the statement. Social media has made our democracy stronger. All right. So who here felt something before you started reasoning? And how fast, as you noticed, did your mind move to explanation or justifying your agreement or disagreement with that position? And you don't have to share in the chat. You're more than welcome to, but I'm really asking rhetorically for everyone just to notice that there was a reaction, right, for each of us. For most of us, something probably showed up instantly. A feeling or a leaning, a sense of agreement, or most likely resistance, perhaps, before any reasoning kicked in. And that moment is what we're going to spend time tonight understanding better. It's not a problem to fix. It's a feature, right? It's not a bug of how human minds work. And it really centers around this truth, this uncomfortable truth, if you will, about how all of us arrive at decision making. There's a really simple explanation at the heart of how decisions actually get made. And most of us like to think that we reason our way into beliefs, that we weigh the evidence, we carefully consider the arguments, the counter arguments, and then we arrive at this conclusion. But what research shows, and what we'll talk through tonight, is that something's a little bit different in that. More often, our intuitions and our feelings lead the way, and our reasoning shows up afterward to make sense of where we've landed. Intuition comes first. Reasoning comes second. That's really the core sentence if you have one takeaway here. And that isn't a flaw, again, in our thinking. It's how our minds have evolved to work. And it applies to everyone in this room tonight, including those of us who care deeply about evidence and policy and getting things right on the climate front. So if we want to understand others, especially in the most challenging and polarized conversations that we find ourselves in these times, we really have to start by understanding ourselves. And that really is why we're starting here. When people think about advocacy skills, they often think about better facts or stronger arguments, and those matter, don't get me wrong. But Bridge starts somewhere more foundational, and that is in emphasizing that relational advocacy works only when whoever we're engaging with feels respected, understood, and safe enough to engage. So if we skip over that layer, even with great information, it's not going to land the way we hope. And another way of saying this really is just naming, if facts were enough, climate change would already be solved, right? There's a line that many of us have heard before. And we see this play out all the time in our own lives, in our own experiences. People can even agree that climate change is real, and they still might not take action or really elevate their own behaviors in a way that responds. Members of Congress can understand the data and not prioritize it still. And even heavy, fact-based conversations, well-intentioned, can stall or even backfire. And it's not because people are ill-informed or lack values to care about it. It's because we often misunderstand how human decision-making works. So what I'd like to do today is just dispel kind of this notion or common myth, if you will, in advocacy that persuasion works like a data transfer. If we just present information the right way or message it the right way perfectly, clearly enough, people will change their minds. And in reality, we're all filtering information through our identity, the values that we already have, the perceived threats to that identity that we have. And so at the core of relational advocacy, it really means understanding how that information is showing up for who we're talking with, not just what we're saying. And to help us kind of get there, we're going to have a metaphor walk into the picture here. In walks a rider and an elephant. And what I'd like us to do is think about this process to help explain what's going on. So the elephant is going to represent a core feature of how our minds work, and that is the kind of emotional, intuitive side, including the identity and belonging. And we'll get into kind of the actual author's thinking of this in just a little bit, Dr. Jonathan Haidt. But you can also think of this on a very high level, the rider as representing reasoning and logic. And most of the time, the elephant is going to move first. And the rider explains, like a great press secretary afterwards, the decision that the elephant made. Again, this isn't a flaw. It's how all of our human brains work. And as Jonathan Haidt, again, the researcher that introduced this metaphor, says, reasoning often feels in charge because it's the one talking. But our intuition, or kind of that immediate kind of automatic form of processing, is actually doing more of the work. But rather than having me kind of explain it, what I'd like to do is actually just share, I found a really helpful 1-minute video online to see the metaphor in action as a resource to kind of help visualize the rider and the elephant. And this is designed by Dan Heath, who's a co-author of Switch, who is another wonderful book that really utilized the rider and the elephant metaphor in their own teaching and writing. And let's just hear directly from them about how this kind of process plays out and why these two parts of the metaphor were chosen to represent.
Psychologists know that there are two systems in our brains, the rational system and the emotional system. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at NYU, came up with a great analogy for these two systems. He said, think of your brain as a human rider atop an elephant. The rider represents the rational system. That's the part of us that plans and problem solves, The writer might do some analyzing and decide, hey, I want to go that way. But it's the elephant, representing the emotional system, that provides the power for the journey. The writer can try to lead the elephant or drag the elephant, but if these two ever disagree, who would you bet on? The elephant has a 6-ton weight advantage, and it's exactly that power imbalance that makes adopting new behaviors very hard.
And to extend that metaphor, what I'd like to do is just have us think about from the perspective of Dr. Haidt. The mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. This is a recent podcast that he was describing this still, 15 years after introducing the concept. The rider represents our conscious verbal reasoning, all of the thoughts that we're aware of or that use logic. Everything else is the elephant. It's the automatic processes. It's the 99% of activity going on in our mind that we're not aware of. And most of us, the reason, again, why this shows up for climate advocacy is that most of us spend a lot of time trying to persuade people in our lives every day through others' riders. We give them all these reasons. Here are the 7 reasons why you're wrong and you should see it my way, right? And the way to persuade people, Dr. Haidt, again, advocates, is to speak to their elephant first. The elephant is a lot stronger than the rider. And so if you get somebody feeling the truth of what you're saying, or if they like you, you sense that engagement, that sense of trust is there, it's far easier for the elephant to want to go in your direction. But if the elephant is digging in its heels and doesn't want to go along with your conclusions, there's really nothing that you can say to persuade the rider. I think that's a really helpful way of kind of summarizing the dynamic at play here. And the important thing to just remind all of us is that this isn't something that just applies to other people or those individuals in your life that you just can't understand how they've arrived at where they're at. This is something that applies to all of us. The elephant and rider framework isn't just about the other side. And if we don't recognize when our own elephant is activated, especially in moments when we feel frustrated or urgent, we risk reenacting the very dynamics that we're trying to change. So that again reinforces why Bridge starts where it does, because self-awareness is foundational to our relational advocacy. And the other thing to build on there is that when the elephant feels threatened, like Dr. Haidt was writing, the rider narrows and it doesn't kind of kick in and say, oh, I'm going to take over for you, elephant, here at this point. It actually goes into defense mode. And I think we all can kind of identify scenarios and experiences in our life where this has happened to us. Our curiosity drops, our openness stops. And when, on the contrary, the elephant feels respected or engaged and intrigued in, a pathway, the rider has room to think and really be able to help guide it in that direction. So the metaphor helps us really focus first on creating the conditions for progress rather than trying to see an outcome that we're forcing. And one of the other things to just name here is that one of the reasons that the elephant and rider has spread so widely is that it gives people a shared language that doesn't shame or pathologize. And we like that in CCL. We like that kind of shared language. So instead of labeling people as irrational or stubborn because they happen to be making different policy choices or what have you than us, it helps us talk about patterns. And that's what's incredibly useful in relational advocacy, right? Finding that common language and also just being able to name, that this model isn't unique to Bridge or even to Dr. Haidt, right? It's a metaphor that we invented. And the elephant and the rider has been widely adopted across psychology, leadership, organizational change theories, because it explains human behavior in a way that's both accurate and usable. And so, again, the bottom line is across decades of research, the finding is the same: intuition leads and reasoning follows. One of the other great kind of giants in emotional psychology, Daniel Goleman, writes, our emotional mind will harness the rational mind to its purposes without realizing the influence of our emotional memory in that process. One of the other fascinating things in preparing for this first training is noting the similarity or kind of a parallel pathway of thinking about this phenomenon with the work of Daniel Kahneman with his Thinking Fast and Slow. And I'm guessing many people on the line have heard of this or perhaps read part or a lot of the book here themselves. But basically, he developed a very similar framework with System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is the fast, automatic, intuitive part of our brain. It makes the snap judgments. And System 2 is the slow, effortful, and deliberate, the rider, if you will, the side of us that has evolved to handle complex reasoning. And just like the elephant and the rider, these systems interact constantly. System one runs most of the show. System two steps in only when needed and often trusts system one's initial conclusions. And I think, again, we're not going to kind of use a lot of the system one and system two language. We're going to use the elephant and the rider, but it's just helpful to note, again, that this is a widely used model with a variety of applications across social science and behavioral science research. What I'd also like to name is just the fact that, the reason why we're starting here, like I've highlighted, is that every skill that we'll build on in this progression of bridge for our journey of the year ahead really depends on this one core ability to recognize when our elephant is activated or when somebody else we're talking to elephants is activated, and then choosing to respond skillfully instead of reflexively, like we might be called into the moment. So that's why we don't start with policy details or talking points. We're going to start with psychology, and we're going to start with relationship, even if we're in disagreement. And this is the bridge shift from trying to convince people to learning how to connect with them in ways that make our shared work possible. And one of the other things that I think is helpful to kind of think about as you're doing your own diagnosis, or you're starting to have inventories in your own life around, well, how do I actually apply this to my member of Congress or my individual in community, you name it, is just asking a better diagnostic question. What might the elephant be reacting to right now? And this single question can really help change how we show up, because instead of assuming someone is being unreasonable or oppositional, it helps us, and you might have your own wording for this, get curious about what's happening beneath the surface. We used to have in our organizing guide for transformational organizing the phrase assume positive intent. It's the same spirit, right? In that we want to be curious, and one of the most powerful relational advocacy tools we have is to ask questions and really get underneath the hood of what's going on here for somebody else's elephant. I'd also like to name where we're at right now in the moment we find ourselves, right? Because the environment we're advocating in is in a lot of upheaval. We're surrounded in a world and a political environment in the US where we have constant stimulation with a news cycle that is, barraging us daily with huge headlines. We are locked into polarization because of our identity-driven conflicts. And it really provides little space for reflection and the chance to slow down and not just kind of be always in our elephant. And understanding the elephant and the rider, I think, is especially important right now because we're operating in an environment that constantly activates that emotional identity that we have, and often without giving space again to reflect or engage thoughtfully. And I think it's also important to name that, climate change isn't just a scientific technical policy solution that we're trying to solve for anymore, right? As a topic, as an issue, it's tied to our identities and to our politics and to our culture and fears around economic freedom and fairness. And, when messages or when a topic feels threatening for anyone, our elephant digs in, and then our riders build defenses around that as the best press secretaries we have. So I think just really naming that feedback loop is key. And, again, just to cycle back into this, like that's also, again, why the common advocacy trap that all of us fall into sometimes without realizing it perhaps is that when we say things like just follow the science, we're usually speaking to the rider, and we're assuming that if the logic is clear enough, the decision is going to follow. And the challenge is that this approach overlooks the elephant. And I think what's key, and the training does a great job of naming this, facts absolutely matter. They're essential, right? We need to operate with them. But they tend to work best when certain conditions are already in place, when trust is present, when identity doesn't feel threatened, like we've already explored with what activates the elephant in our thinking, and when people feel respected. And so let's actually talk about how to read the elephant in real time, to understand how to kind of make sure, now that we have a shared way of thinking about the elephant and the rider, this next question of how do we actually know what's happening in a conversation when the elephant is being engaged or being threatened? And the good news is that it usually leaves clues. So learning to read these signs are actually going to be helpful to know when trust is building, when it's time to slow down and reconnect. So the key question, right? How do you actually know, based on social science and a lot of the other areas that we've been researching for Bridge, when you've actually connected with somebody's elephant? And it isn't rocket science. These are all cues that obviously, as emotionally intelligent individuals, we're aware of. It's important to name that when you're connected with somebody's elephant, the atmosphere of the conversation changes, right? You'll often notice that the other person feels understood rather than managed. Their tone softens. They offer nuance. They're willing to explore rather than just defend a certain position on whatever you might be talking about. And there's signs that emotional safety is present, that the writer now has room to engage. And what it feels like when the elephant is with you in that conversation doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be agreement. You can be deeply connected to someone's elephant and still disagree, right? That's the hope. We're hoping to be able to do that and get skilled at practicing that. And what changes though is the quality of engagement. When people pause and ask questions or acknowledge complexity, it's often a sign that their elephant feels respected enough to allow the rider to stay open and giving that direction. And on the contrary, we've all been in situations where we can, reflect and remember when you're not connected with somebody else's elephant, how the conversation often tightens. You might hear the same point being repeated or notice the increased certainty with how statements are being made or even having the temperature rise. And these are signs that the elephant feels threatened and that the rider is now working overtime to actually defend an identity rather than explore ideas that are being discussed. And so when you notice that disconnection, because it will happen for all of us, right? Here is my challenge to you. Noticing disconnection isn't a failure, it's actually information. And Bridge teaches us to treat these moments as cues to slow down and to reorient. So instead of pushing harder, the invitation is to reflect, acknowledge, and reconnect to the level of values. And we'll get into that again in future lessons. But often that shift alone is enough to help calm the elephant, reopen space for a rider-based conversation. And one of the best ways that we can do that in our own lives, in our own dialogue, in checking on our own elephant, is to check in on our own, right? So when we notice our own sense of urgency increasing or frustration boiling, we're better able to then choose curiosity over correction if we can run kind of a quiet diagnostic question or two. Am I trying to be right now or to understand? Is my tone inviting or corrective? What am I feeling right now? These are key questions to really help explore all of our inner elephants and slow down that process when we feel kind of dug in, when all 6 tons of us wants to resist whatever direction we're being pulled into going. And what I'd like to do tonight is also help this come alive with a case study. And I think we'll be trying to do this with each of the different trainings that we're having. And for me, when thinking about this, if building trust and calming elephants is central to our advocacy, then it's also important to understand environments that make that harder. And social media clearly is one of those most powerful environments. That's why I intentionally kind of used it to provoke the first reaction that all of us had tonight. And it really helps, it doesn't help, I should say, it shapes how our elephants show up long before we enter into any conversation. So let's just, briefly use social media as a case study because it clearly shows all of our elephant and rider's dynamics at work, how intuition and emotion are often activated long before reasoning has a chance to engage. And exploring this, I hope, will help us better understand how our own reactions are shaped so that we can choose advocacy-based approaches that are more intentional and effective. And I think the key thing just to start off the bat with is just naming that social media certainly didn't invent the elephant and rider, but it has sure learned how to exploit it. Platforms are optimized to activate emotion and our inner elephants because emotion keeps us engaged, right? And that's what the algorithm wants. Engagement and ongoing kind of being hooked to that platform. So the fastest way to do that is by triggering outrage or fear or moral certainty and signaling to your own team. But again, that's kind of the environment that we're operating under. And in elephant and rider terms, I think what's key to name is the elephant gets stirred up first. Then the rider is recruited not to explore or reflect, but to justify and defend whatever the elephant is already feeling in that pressure charged environment. And that's why online debates rarely produce movement in the direction of shared understanding, even among well-intentioned people. And thoughtful, kind people, including all of us, can sound completely different online than we do in person. And that's, again, not a character flaw. That's a context shift of where and how we're having these dialogues. And especially in an environment that rewards reaction rather than reflection, it's going to be an inbuilt part of that system. And so I think it's really key to kind of name CCL's positionality in that greater context of our social media driven kind of narratives these days. And that is naming also this acknowledgement that if outrage alone were enough to solve climate change, one would think that would already be done or well on its way of at least being more addressed than it has been, right? Only being treated as a side dish, continuing to be put off further and further away from the front of the menu. And outreach moves attention, but what moves policy is trust. And that moves through relationships, credibility, and shared problem solving, none of which have a premium in social media's environment. And so for us as CCL volunteers, really a line that I invite anyone to carry forward with you is this. Social media and our modern politics overall trains our inner elephant to react. We are in a system that is daily training that reaction. And Bridge, in return, trains us to create the conditions for trust where real connection becomes possible. And so it's really important to name that Bridge exists because we're choosing a different path of impact. Instead of activating threats or engaging in a politics of contempt, we're focusing instead on calming our elephants, if you will, right? And trying to find conditions or create conditions that can find the rider arriving into real engagement. And so we started with the rider and the elephant because before we can change minds, we have to understand how our minds actually work. And especially in a moment where so much of our culture is designed to keep us activated and divided and stuck, I hope that this metaphor is going to help unlock a way for each of us to, find a new set of tools to really move in a new direction collectively together. And so let's do this. Let's do some practice activities. I'm sensitive to wanting to make sure that we're not going to overdo it tonight, but I do think that, again, in the words of Mark Reynolds, practice makes perfect, right? And so for many of us, for many years, whether it was through laser talks or other communication activities, what makes effective CCL advocates is having the chance to actually kind of build some muscle memory with these skills. And so they're not, as relational advocacy skill sets, they're not just something we absorb by hearing about them. They're built through an active participation. And what I'd like to do tonight, and this is in the online training number 1 as well. And again, a reminder, we're going to do one activity and then review a couple other ones together, and then we'll have the chance to look ahead and save the rest of the time for Q&A. But let's take a moment to put in this practice, because work only really works if we're able to recognize our own elephants too. So one of the core insights that we've talked about is that strong feelings usually show up first, right? So we often experience a reaction or a pull or a sense of certainty before we can fully explain why. And what I'd like to do is think about this. Our explanations tend to come later. The writer is very good at making sense of where we've already landed. That's literally what it's been trained to do your entire life, even when it feels like we've reasoned our way there. And that's really why self-awareness is such a foundational skill in relational advocacy, because if we can notice what's happening inside of us, we're much better equipped to stay curious with others instead of just react to whatever they're putting out there. So I'd like to invite everyone to just reflect on this. Think of an issue that you care about that reliably sparks a strong emotional reaction for you. It can be climate related. It can be entirely something else. On the state coordinator call last week, Henry Slack shared about an argument he and his roommate had around if they should use a dish sponge or a dish scrubby or something like that. I mean, whatever it is, there's a variety of ways that you can come at this, but just, the invite here is to begin thinking about something as an issue that you care strongly about as an emotional attachment. And what I'd like to do is have the chance for you to then do the following. Before explaining why you believe what you believe and kind of justifying that decision making behind it, I want you to think about what values of yours feel activated in having arrived at that kind of strong emotional feeling. And I think it'd also be very helpful if we had the chance to just have everyone also think about, what's at stake for you? Why is this something that you care about? We'd love to make sure to have the chance to just, slow down and have the discussion, and also notice in these small groups of how quickly that feeling arrived before you actually analyzed it. I know that I got a couple of emails ahead of time too around other group leaders saying, oh, are we going to have the chance to kind of have a variety of reflection prompts that we can select from for our chapter because people are wanting to utilize some of this in their own chapter meetings? Kind of present these as a menu of options that you can draw from as CCL leaders. And you're welcome to choose any of these that feel right for your chapter or a small group or even a conversation with friends or family. And so as I read them, just notice which ones resonate or spark curiosity with you. But they're all meant to be literally 2-minute activities or reflection prompts that you and your chapters can really engage with to further help the elephant and the rider come to life. And in the meantime, feel free to put any examples from your original breakout in the chat as I see people are doing. So this first one we call the Convince Me Challenge. And the prompt is simply, think of a belief that you hold strongly. Now, imagine that somebody gives you a perfectly logical argument against it. Do you think that you would soften your position? Do you think that your defenses would activate? What happens in your body before you even really have a lot of that conscious thought? And the goal here is to reveal the limits of logic without attacking, kind of our logical system, and just set up kind of, again, this idea of relational advocacy and dialogue. Here's another prompt. This one we call the identity switch. And the prompt is simply, imagine you hear the exact same argument, but 2 times. Once from somebody that you trust, and again, a different time from somebody that you distrust. In your own reflection, did the argument land differently, depending on who you heard it from? And as you reflect, what changed? The facts or the relationship? And what does that suggest about how all of us arrive at our own belief systems? Really, the goal here is to surface the relational filter explicitly and prepare all of us to just really kind of understand the importance of trust. I'll do a couple more here. So here's a different one. This one's called the text message never sent. Think of a message or comment that you almost sent, but didn't. Why did you not send it? What emotion was driving it? What changed your mind not to? What part of you intervened? I think that in terms that are kind of easy to understand, this allows us to recognize that elephant and rider interaction in a pretty relatable human way. Another thing that I'll throw out there tonight is this is an activity actually that we first engaged in way back on Earth Day of the year of COVID in 2020, when we did a big Earth Day rally with Dr. Catherine Hayhoe and a bunch of Braver Angels friends. And part of this was a workshop called Depolarizing Within. And this gets back into the self-awareness kind of skill set as an advocacy skill set. And so what I'd like you to do, I'm just going to pose 5 questions here, and it's entirely all right no matter where you kind of land on any of these. But the goal is to reflect on our own kind of inner polarization that we've kind of embedded, whether we're aware of it or actively feeding it or not. And for each of these next 5 questions, I want you to think about, the response is, do you feel it rarely? Do you feel it all the time? Where are you at on that spectrum? Please don't feel like you have to put this in the chat. This is meant to be a self-reflection. But again, if this is helpful for you to have discussion prompt in your activity, your chapter, great. So number 1, how often do I find myself thinking about those people on the other political side without much regard for the variation among them? Again, key on the variation among them. Do you do that often? Do you do that never? Number 2, how often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group and mainly positive motives to my group? Again, all these incredibly human. Number 3, how often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how a reasonable person could remain within that group? I do that often. I do that rarely. Number 4, how often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side with the best people on my side? And lastly, How often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side? Again, all of these are human answers, but the dynamic of being able to kind of tap into how we arrive at our belief systems and what reinforces them. All right, so lastly, what I'd like to do is just have this last prompt, and then we'll get to kind of wrapping things up and looking ahead. But this is what we're calling the advocacy mirror prompt. And the invite is to think about a time when you felt that you were absolutely right about a climate issue, which I'm guessing is quite often for all of us. And yet the other person that you're talking about or talking to didn't move. And the question here for us to reflect on is, what did you feel in that moment when you realized that it really wasn't having an impact? What might the other person's elephant have been reacting to cause them to kind of be dug in and not move? And what might your elephant have been reacting to? So again, deeper discussion. I know I'm going through these quickly, but I do want to have the chance to give some other prompts for us all in our small groups or after tonight to help kind of the core tenets of lesson one come to life. So let's look ahead. What I'd like to name here first and foremost is, like all trainings, for anyone that's attending here tonight, please feel free to click that link I put in the chat to log your training and get credit for attending. And the key thing is, if you're listening to this live or watching the recording later, we'll make sure to put that link in the description field online wherever you're tuning in. But outside of that, if you're on any of these Bridge training pages, what I'm showing here is a graphic. And that is, right now, each Bridge training page has the written content, and then at the very top, it has this other tab called Knowledge Check. And to get credit for attending, to have your training logged for any of these other ones, you need to actually take our quiz, because we're actually trying to gauge how people are, engaging with key concepts. The great news is that this is not a hard quiz, so you should be able to answer it very quickly. But just a reminder that outside of these live trainings, we do ask that people complete the short comprehension quiz to get credit, and that's going to help us demonstrate the impact of our work. So thanks in advance for taking a moment to do that. I'd also like to name that Bridge isn't really any individual training, right? It's a learning path that we're engaged on throughout 2026 ahead. It's going to be divided up into 3 units or parts. Unit 1 is for this first quarter, and we're going to understand how decisions are made and our moral foundations, and really kind of putting all of that to work with more reframing. We're going to dive into part 2 with relational advocacy skills and becoming an advocate detective. And then part 3, as we transition from our summer conference, is going to be learning from experienced communicators. So key thing is just to name, zooming out, Bridge isn't this one-off training tonight or a single set of ideas. It's a learning path. And tonight we're building off of this decision of how decisions happen, why relationships matter, and that everything that follows builds on this foundation. And now really that we can recognize, when our elephants are activated with this foundation in place, we're actually going to start building the skills that, can take advantage of that with moral reframing, listening, strategic asks, et cetera. Everything else is going to be building from here. And so if you are able to kind of ground yourself, the heart of Bridge, really, I hope as people take away tonight, main emphasis is we're starting here because it keeps us humble and curious and focused on relationships that can endure across difference. So understanding intuition opens the door and opens, us up to understanding values that can help us walk through that together. And that's why for next month's training, we're going to turn to the moral values that shape how people experience climate policy, climate priorities differently from the very start. And so we have 10 minutes for questions like we've talked about. Tonight, I'd like to just close by saying a huge thank you for everyone that's on tonight or listening in later. If you have ongoing thoughts and reflections, please feel free to use our forums. And you're also more than welcome to email our membership team, and they'll make sure to route it to the right place, whether it's our field ops department or our government affairs, you name it. And that email is just simply membership@citizensclimate.org. And so it's been an honor, obviously, to be together tonight and to have some fun exploring this first angle in Bridge. And thanks for all the love in the chat. With everyone tonight, thank you so much for being there. I know we're at the top of the hour. I hope that this was helpful. It's really helpful to see everyone's poll responses. I'll share those results. And I really just look forward to continuing to be on this journey together with you. So we'll see you on the last Thursday of February. And in the meantime, I'll unmute all lines and can't wait to hear about your discussions in the field, everyone. Thanks so much and take care, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well
done.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.